The human anomaly. Very little literature addresses the freeze response in the human species, even in the case of overwhelming threat and trauma. It is rare for a human being to actually collapse and appear unconscious without physical injury. Although some people will be shaky and tremulous after a shocking event, they seldom pursue the relatively stereotypical and involuntary physical behavior of the freeze discharge seen in animals. Rather, they will frequently relate that they felt as if they were in shock. This is often related as a sense of detachment, numbing, and even confusion. Time often seems to stand still. Some patients report that they feel as if they are detached and removed from their body, occasionally reporting the events of the trauma as if they were seeing them as a third person. The out-of-body experience. Although some will relate that they were full of adrenaline, many report the sensation as one of remarkable calm. Although serious injuries may have occurred, pain is usually not intense during this period. A state consistent with the role of endorphins in the freeze response. Psychologists commonly refer to these phenomena as dissociation, which is defined as an unconscious process by which a group of mental processes is separated from the rest of the thinking process, resulting in an independent functioning of these processes and a loss of the usual relationships, for example, a separation of affect from cognition. Many researchers now feel that dissociation constitutes a major element of the freeze response, and people who report symptoms of shock and numbness after a traumatic event and exhibit symptoms of dissociation are actually in the freeze response at the time. In fact, many of the post-traumatic symptoms that occur often for years after the unresolved trauma are characteristic for dissociation, or the recurrence of the feelings and perceptions of freezing. When cues in the environment mimic those messages related to old severe trauma, the conditioned emergence of a failed act of self-defense may seem quite inappropriate and has been called conversion hysteria by mental health professionals. We will discuss this in detail in the chapter on dissociation. The salient point here is that human beings, at least in Western cultures, seldom go through the somatic and autonomic discharge after a traumatic event. One is tempted to consider the rarity of this phenomenon in humans as a positive adaptation to basic animal behavior as a result of the brain's evolving frontal neocortex, which allows us to think, problem solve, and plan without the tyranny of primitive instinct. There is a real concern, however, that this apparent lack of physical completion of the traumatic experience in the human species may indeed not be a functionally adaptive mechanism, Instead, it may represent a dangerous suppression of instinctual reflex behavior, resulting in the imprinting of the traumatic experience in unconscious memory and arousal systems of the brain. An answer to this dilemma may lie in observation of animal behavior. Levine describes a conversation that he had with African gamekeepers. When they are captured, animals commonly enter a freeze or immobility response. After release, they will usually go through a form of reflex physical behavior typical of the freeze discharge. If they do not go through a period of shaking, however, the gamekeepers note that they will usually die after release into the wild. This fact might lead one to speculate that retaining the autonomic and procedural memories of the traumatic experience by these animals reduces their capacity to adapt to the threats and demands of existence in the wild. Basically, the freeze discharge may be a means of reversing, extinguishing fear conditioning, the prerequisite for trauma, PTSD. Clearly, self-protective skills in animals are likely to be inhibited if they are prone to experience states analogous to intermittent dissociation in humans, or if they are fear-conditioned. In fact, evidence indicates that freeze discharge may also be inhibited in animals chronically maintained in captivity, such as domesticated and laboratory animals, as well as those imprisoned in zoos and circuses. Indeed, early studies of the stress response in laboratory animals were limited by the intrinsic arousal associated with handling them, leading to the freeze response and subsequent experimental neurosis. In fact, the necessity for laboratory and zoo animals to live in cages may intrinsically create learned helplessness and subsequent vulnerability to trauma. Acculturation of the human species has resulted in an increasing pattern of urban living in closely confined habitats that intrinsically might inhibit the instinctual capability to flee or defend oneself under threat. This inhibition, in turn, might generate a state of helplessness, predisposing to the freeze response in humans under threat. The state of intense proximity and cultural interdependence may also act to inhibit the natural discharge of autonomic freeze energy in acculturated humans. The constraints and restrictions imposed on the populace of a complex culture by its institutions for the purpose of maintaining order may also intrinsically create a low-level state of helplessness. The suppression of the freeze discharge in humans may suggest that we also live in a cage, in our case a cultural cage. It may explain the prevalence of symptoms of trauma in complex modern cultures. If we do not discharge or complete the freeze response, our brains will literally be fooled by environmental cues into thinking that the memories of the traumatic event that inevitably periodically re-emerge represent events that are actually in the present and not actually in the past. When they emerge, we go through all of the experiences of that event, emotional, cognitive, and autonomic, as if it was actually happening again. Retention in procedural memory of this experience may serve as an internal cue for recurrent arousal patterns, alternating with numbing and dissociation, constituting the basically bipolar and self-perpetuating nature of PTSD, until that act of flight or self-defense and is unable to relegate it to memory as a past experience. And emergence of that past memory in present consciousness is likely to trigger repeatedly the freeze dissociation response.
I'm very pleased that the Trauma Research Foundation could sponsor this particular showing. I think it's a terribly important movie which has very large large reverberations. I was very much part of the beginning of this pharmacological revolution in the 70s. I was a young psychiatrist, and suddenly we had a chance to change people's lives with medications. And some people's lives were changed by medications. So medication had an important contribution to make. But then a whole other issue came in, and that's the low ranking of psychiatry in medicine. Psychiatry is a poor profession, always is in the basement of the hospitals. And once we started doing drugs, we became a more prosperous profession. We made more money. And psychiatry departments started to make a lot of money on the benefits of the pharmaceutical companies. And so their prestige rose as their income rose. What happened at this point is psychiatry became a one-man show. Instead of seeing medications as one possible option to help people with, they only learned about medications and they learned about nothing else. I think our culture is like that. It looks for one solution and then we give up other issues. And I think our whole society has moved more and more in people looking for simple answers to complex solutions, and for people sort of giving quick pills and quick fixes to complex stuff. And we are frantic. America is a frantic country. Why do we have symptoms, by and large, as warning signs? We feel anxious because something tells us this is not right. You feel angry because you're not being heard. You feel depressed because nothing is happening. These are signs that something isn't working. Psychiatry jumping in with medicines, in many cases, made this worse. In some cases, it did work. It's not like all or nothing. But psychiatry became a one-man show, and people didn't learn about psychotherapy, and they stopped learning about EMDR, and they stopped learning about other ways of regulating yourself. My proposal is that in every classroom in America, from K to 12, there are 4 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, and self-regulation, so that all of us live in a culture where we learn what innate capacities we have to take care of ourselves, so that we become informed consumers about our own lives. And for example, I did an NIH-funded study on yoga for PTSD. It turned out that yoga is a better treatment for PTSD than any medication that people have studied. I published 3 scientific articles on that. I've never seen a psychopharm clinic turn into a yoga studio. We have very good treatment for PTSD, like EMDR, but I know barely any psychiatrist who knows how to do EMDR. I barely know any psychiatrist who knows any of the effective treatments for PTSD. In study over study, we show that veterans do not benefit from drugs. The biggest consumer of drugs is the Veterans Administration. The scientific evidence shows that these drugs don't work. And yet billions and billions of dollars are misspent on veterans who become more and more depressed and more and more dysfunctional. What is wrong with our system, with our profession, that we don't look at the reality of? It's important to think about the nature of trauma. And trauma is not some unpleasant thing that happens to people. Unpleasant things happen all the time, and we're actually quite well equipped to deal with unpleasant things. Trauma is something horrendous, something that makes you stare with horror. Trauma is about horror, something that you stare in the face and it's too much. You cannot possibly imagine what you can do, and you think your life is over. An experience like that is an experience you don't want to remember. And so at the core of trauma is this need to push it away and to try not to remember it. Trauma treatment is about making it safe for people to remember, making it safe for people to stare reality in the face. Having traumatic post-traumatic stress reactions is about being unable to face the truth. And so at the end, exposure treatments is important, but not blasting people with the memory of the trauma and confronting them with it, because that is traumatizing for them again. Now, we need to make it safe for people to observe what happened back then without them becoming freaked out and overwhelmed by remembering. So our job as clinicians to make it safe for people to remember what happened to them back then, and for them to come to the conclusion, yes, this happened to me, it was terrible, but it happened a long time ago. And that's the core skill of becoming a trauma therapist, is the capacity to help people to safely remember. The first modality that taught me that it's possible to help people to feel safe was EMDR. And for me, EMDR is an indispensable modality of treatment. If I could not do EMDR, I don't think I could be a good trauma therapist anymore. That may not be universally true. I believe if you're a very good body-oriented therapist, as Peter Levine or Pat Ogden or some other people teach, you can probably process trauma as well through those modalities as you might do it for EMDR. I also suspect that if you are a very good hypnosis expert, that you might be able to help people to come to a very safe place where they can actually observe what happened. But for me, EMDR has always been a very important part. And so with EMDR, you can allow people to go to a place where they become quite agitated. An example I have in my book, but I have so many examples. Now let me give you an example from my recent practice. A guy came to see me from a local school here in Boston, where we have so many schools, who was crushed in a car accident. He was riding his bike, and a car came from the side road, drove over him, hit him as he was riding his bike, and dragged him along, and the driver of the car was unaware that somebody was being dragged underneath her car. And in the process of being dragged, he lost most of a leg. A terrible thing. He walks into my office on crutches, looking terribly distraught. He's an athlete, and I feel like, oh my God, there's probably nothing I can do for this man because it's so horrible. But, you know, I've done this EMDR research that shows that 80% of people with that condition get better in between 3 and 8 sessions. And so I have this data somewhere in the back of my mind, even though as a person, I can't imagine how this guy can ever overcome the horrors of that memory of what happened to him and basically the loss of his leg. And so I say, somewhat despairing in a way myself, let's do some EMDR. And we start doing EMDR, and I'll talk more about EMDR in the course itself. And as we do the EMDR, he at some point starts smiling. And I say, what do you get now? He says, you know, I was so strong. I was being dragged underneath that car, but I could hold on to the chassis of the car as I was dragged along. And if I'd let go, the wheels of this car would have driven over me. But look what a strong guy I am. And he recalled how powerful he was. So he himself came up with this image of power. Didn't come from me. His own brain was able to generate it. And that's what you see all the time in these good treatments, is that you liberate the healing power of people's own minds and own brains. And so I go on with the EMDR, and again, a little while later, he smiles again, or he has a certain joy in his face, and he says, you know, I'll never play sports again because this leg is basically gone for me. But you know, that leg saved my life, because if that leg hadn't sort of held on, my pelvis would have dragged along the floor, and my pelvis would have been destroyed, and I would be dead by now. So I'm really very grateful for that leg, for sacrificing itself so I could be alive. You know, that stuff we cannot make up for other people. And so EMDR was able to liberate these creative forces in people's minds. And this is what we see in other treatments also, is that people come up with their own solutions. And all that we do is we're technically proficient enough to help people to find their solutions.